Well, the Baylor Bears were ran out of the gym by Shaka Smart's Marquette Golden Eagles to tip off the Big 12 Big East Challenge. And we're wondering if this game says more about Marquette or more about Baylor.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is up? Welcome to the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host, Andy Patton, joined today by Leif Thulin of Leif Tulin, Leif, my apologies, talking all about Locked On NBA Big Board. Leif, we got to talk Baylor Marquette because this was just an absolute ridiculous result. As soon as I turned the game on, I was like, we're only 5 minutes into the game. And I was like, I don't think Baylor's got a chance anymore. Like, I think this thing's already over just a few minutes into the game. 20 turnovers for the Bears. Just got absolutely mauled across half court. I can speak for the Gonzaga fans out there who watched this game, who I think felt a little bit of catharsis watching Baylor struggle to get the ball across half court and struggle with pressure from opposing guards. That is something that Gonzaga is intimately familiar with, having played Baylor in that national championship game a couple of years ago. This is a Baylor team that's kind of looked a little messy early in the year. And I'm curious if you think that this game, how much it really says about Baylor and their prospects going forward, or if it's just one of those things where, hey, maybe Marquette's a little better than we thought.
I'd say it's both, but more of Baylor not being where we thought, myself included. I told you before the show, and I said this on multiple podcasts, I had Baylor as my favorite to lift the banner this year because they brought in two really experienced guards. Keontae George looked amazing this summer, like absolutely sensational in the global games. And I had questions about their front court, but I tend to lean backcourt dominant, but their front court's not been very good, and their backcourt's taking on an enormous burden. And, it's like Atlas lifting the sky, and sometimes you just can't do it.
Yeah.
And I think that's been the case. There's 20 turnovers, but it almost felt like there were more. I felt like the 20 turnovers didn't quite sum up the immense pressure in the first half. It was like if they got the ball into the front court, now the offense had no set, no flow. And that's what good guards are able to do. So that is a little puzzling. I do think they'll get better in that regard. But I think the larger issue right now is that Keontae George is supposed to be kind of this like super scorer, and he's just uncomfortable in his role. LJ Cryer shot 50% and actually played decently if you look at the stat line, but there was no rhythm to the game. Adam Flagler shot over 50% in this game, but once again, no rhythm to the game. And then Jalen Bridges and Caleb Lohner had to take enormous leaps if Flo Thamba and more namely Jonathan Tchamwa weren't ready, and Flo Thamba is never going to give you a scoring punch. He's just going to be solid defensively and rebound the ball. Right. But Jonathan Tchamwa could. He's out, and Lohner and Bridges combined to play pretty poorly and have so far this season. So yes, I think we learned more about Baylor, that they're not ready or at the level that I anticipated they'd be, or even close to it, quite frankly. And I think for now they're off of the contenders list because there's just such a burden on their guards, and there's kind of a mismatch, a jigsaw puzzle of fits. So I'm a little more off. And then just a quick note about Shaka Smart. Shaka Smart always has one upset a year that you're like, man, he coached a game, and he does it, and he puts a lot of pressure on. I think Marquette's better than people anticipated going into this year because they were kind of the 7th, 8th team in the Big East, I'd say, by general consensus. They're better than that, but I don't think they're a world beater despite winning dominantly against Baylor.
Absolutely. Yeah. The depth for Baylor in this game was just really, really tough. I mean, obviously George not having a good game or really start to the season, quite frankly. 12 points, 1 of 5 from deep, 4 turnovers. It's not going to get it done for a star freshman, a guy that you really brought in with the intention of him being a significant part of what you're doing with the roster. And then Caleb Lohner and Dale Bonner off the bench, 39 combined minutes for those two guys, 2 points total in 39 combined minutes. I know that, Lohner is here mostly for his rebounding presence. He wasn't even a great scorer at BYU, but you need more guys who can put the ball in the hoop. With Thamba not being a guy who's a great scorer, with the depth not being tremendous scorers, and with George not stepping into that role yet. Again, it's the 1st of December, as many of you are listening to this. There's still a lot of time this season, but boy, that was it looked like the team that doesn't have an identity yet, and that's not what I was expecting to be saying about Baylor at this point in the season.
Yeah, that's certainly a true point. And one last thing is Baylor has been great in terms of their guard play, offensive efficiency, but this year they're struggling defensively too.
Yeah.
That's foreign. They kind of founded the no middle defense in Texas Tech, and despite what Ken Palm is saying right now, and actually that's the reason it was weird. I was on 2022. I was stunned to be seeing where they were ranked. 75th defensively, and I'd argue that's an accurate ranking right now. They're not staying in front of the point of attack, and their bigs are Flo Thamba's solid. Jalen Bridges hasn't been good defensively, and Jonathan Chamba, you're seeing his impact by omission here because he's not able to play. You're seeing how important he was, and sometimes that you don't realize until too late.
Yeah. Well, the point of this segment was going to be pretenders, contenders. It still is. Obviously, we kind of had to shoehorn some Baylor Marquette talk in after that game. I wanted to talk about some of the teams in the top 10, top 15, or teams that kind of have some helium right now that we consider either to be pretenders, where maybe this is a bit of a mirage, or of course contenders, teams that have a legitimate chance at carrying that banner in April. So the first team I want to talk about as a pretender is Kansas. I'm not sold on the Jayhawks, even as the defending champs, of course. We've seen some really inconsistent offensive performances from them. I'm not sure they have the depth to be a team that really challenges for all of it. I mean, they barely beat Wisconsin. That's not a horrible game. Wisconsin's not a bad team, but they also single-digit win over Southern Utah. Had that bad loss to Tennessee. Again, Tennessee is a good team, but they only scored 50 points against the Volunteers. Good defensive team, but still, you have to be able to be more competitive in games like that. And frankly, they have a game coming up that we're going to talk about a little bit later in the show for our upset watch segment that I think could be an opportunity for Kansas to some of the problems that we've seen with Kansas in ways that they've kind of barely escaped so far. I think it could come to a head against a really good defensive team in the coming days.
Yeah, I'm with you on Kansas. And for my pretenders, this may be a shock to some. I don't think any of the blue bloods are contenders.
No blue bloods.
No blue bloods. Kansas, Kentucky, Duke, Carolina.
Yeah.
And I'd even toss in a few new bloods in there, but I don't want to go a laundry list. But I'll explain the blue blood one. I agree. I echo every bit of the sentiment you just shared about Kansas. Duke, the issue for me is there's so many moving pieces. They've got good guard play in Roach and Proctor, but they kind of limit each other.
Yeah,
is the way I feel about it. Lively and Whitehead are coming back off of injury. You'd say, oh, wow, there's good growth potential, and there probably is. But I don't see the chemistry yet. I honestly have been unimpressed in each game I've watched them play. I'd argue that Xavier was the more connected team and probably had a chance to win against Duke in that one. Duke got their doors blown off by Purdue. Yeah. And then Kentucky, we talked about this in a little bit off air after last episode, is I think Calipari's really, I've never thought of him as a great X's and O's coach, but he seems to have lost his touch. And I don't think this team plays well together whatsoever, despite having all the talent in the world and a roster that should play well together. I think their biggest weakness is Xavier Wheeler, and you don't want your point guard to be your biggest weakness. Yep. And that leaves me North Carolina. No team frustrated me more this week than North Carolina. They had 30-something shots taken by both Caleb Love and RJ Davis, and they had 34 turnovers and 34 assists in the last two games of the Maui between their backcourt. And their backcourt was expected to be one of the best 5 in the country. Armando Bacot has been a little hobbled. And they just don't pass. At the end of the game, they had 4, and I kid you not, 4 opportunities to win the game at the end of the clock, and they had 1 pass, and that involved the inbounds pass. Yep. And so I just think there's chemistry issues, and they're shouldering a lot of expectation after just about winning the national championship, and I think they're finding it's hard to be the top dog. And I think that you're going to see more of Carolina struggling, and then they'll get a little bit better, but I don't see them as true contenders.
Well, I want to talk about my contender that I have for my list, and that is a team that we talked about extensively on Wednesday's episode of Locked On College Basketball. That is the UConn Huskies. I know that their schedule has been not as difficult as maybe it seems like it could have been. Obviously, they played through the PK Invitational. They played Oregon. They played Alabama. They played Iowa State. That is not a bad trio of games. It was a very banged-up Oregon team. It's a somewhat inconsistent Iowa State team and an Alabama team that I don't think is quite there yet, although they, of course, turned around and won that game against North Carolina in 4 overtimes. I think UConn has a ton of depth. They have a lot of scoring. Andre Jackson hasn't even been the player that he's capable of being yet, and this team is still 8-0. They certainly have some issues. They're not perfect. No team at this point is perfect in the season. But this is a team that I thought was, hey, this is maybe a team in the 2025 range, maybe a team that'll be third, fourth in the Big East to, 4 or 5 seed type of thing. And they look like they have a potential to be much, much better than that this season.
Yeah, UConn and Creighton seem to be the runaways in the Big East at this point. I'll say for my contender, I'll take a team that impressed me in Maui. I think, honestly, you could say any of the 3 teams between Arizona, Creighton, and Arkansas, but I'll take Arkansas because they always get better. They've made back-to-back Elite Eights. I think Arkansas has the capacity defensively to be very disruptive, and they showed in the late game, even though it wasn't necessarily pretty against San Diego State or quite frankly, against Creighton at the end, but they were able to get it done. And one of those two, and they were down against Creighton, and Creighton played a great game. But they're playing without Nick Smith. That could cause chemistry issues in the short term. But I think add another player that's got significant talent to a squad like that. Defensively, they're solid. They've got a few glue guys that they can really score the ball in a plethora of ways, and with a myriad of different players. And so I think they've got a recipe that works in March, and so I'll put them to my contenders list, even though they're coming off a third place finish where you felt like you could want more, and so I think they're a team that is being underranked right now.
Absolutely, especially with Smith coming back. That's such a huge addition for them. Leaf, the National Player of the Year conversation has already kind of shifted a little bit here at the end of November, start of December. Of course, Zach Edey from Purdue is a player who has joined that conversation. There's a few notable names who have kind of slipped off the radar, or at least maybe a little farther down the Player of the Year rankings. We're going to talk all about that in the second segment. But before we do that, I want to tell you all about Bet Online. College basketball and the NBA are back in action, and college football and the NFL remain in the thick of their seasons. BetOnline.net is your number one source for all of your betting needs and sports information. From all the latest odds, contests, and player props, you name it, BetOnline remains the best spot for all the latest sports developments, including podcasts and reviews for all the leagues this season. And it's not just basketball. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information needs, including live betting and your favorite Vegas casino games. They even have lines for coaching changes across every major sport, so even in the offseason, you can get your fix. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, Leaf, lots of players in contention for the National Player of the Year award. Of course, it is December 1st, so there is a long ways to go before this award is determined. But I want to talk about a few of the presumed preseason frontrunners, kind of where they're at this point. You kind of made a quick mention of Armando Bacot, who's been a little bit hobbled. He's been having a productive season, but maybe not at the level that we would have expected. Going into the year, in my mind and in the minds of many of the people who produced preseason content, we saw basically the same 3 guys on the top of the list, and then kind of a rotating group of guys in the 4-5 for people releasing 5-team All-Americans. The top 3 names were always Drew Timme, Oscar Tshiebwe, Armando Bacot. The 3 bigs, the 3 guys returning, the 3 players with a very similar profile who all kind of made the decision to return to play in college basketball as opposed to going professional, where their skill set is not as in demand, I guess is the best way to put it. So far, Drew Timme, 20 points, 7.5 boards for him. Of course, Gonzaga hasn't really had the depth around him, and he's kind of been forced to do a lot more than he has had to do historically in his career. Oscar Tshiebwe was battling an injury early in the year. His numbers are down, but he's still averaging 14.5 points, 13.5 rebounds. And then Armando Bacot, as you mentioned, a little bit banged up, 16.5 points and 11 boards for him. Do you still feel like this is the trio that people have to go through in order to get to the National Player of the Year, or do you feel like the list has kind of shifted a little bit at this point in the season?
I think they're all in contention. I'd say if I were to name a front runner right now, it'd be Zach Edey.
Yeah.
I think Zach Edey's propelled the team that I'd say doesn't have the talent of the other 3 players' teams and into the highest ranking of those 3 or of those 4, I guess.
Yeah.
So I'd say Zach Edey, he's the heart and soul of his team. He's extremely valuable. So Zach Edey, I think, it has to be thrust into that conversation. I'd add Hunter Dickinson and Trace Jackson Davis as contenders on solid Big Ten squads as well. But I agree. I think Tshiebwe and Timme are going to stay there. I think Bacot's fallen out of limelight a little bit because of the just the chucking, quite frankly, of Caleb Love and RJ Davis to an extent. Definitely Caleb Love.
Yeah.
And so I think it makes it harder for Bacot to win that award without getting the ball.
Yeah,
so
well, and an interesting thing with them too is that in that game against Alabama, defensively they were struggling to find ways to play both Bacot and Pete Nance at the same time. It's like those are two of your best players, and they couldn't play them at the same time. And you got to wonder if that's a situation that continues to crop up for the Tar Heels. That's going to make it a lot harder to win. If your National Player of the Year candidate can't play at the end of games because of defensive limitations, that's going to be a problem.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I'd start my discussion with Zach Edey today. And then obviously I think Timme and Tshiebwe will probably be 2 and 3 on that list. And one name I'd toss in would be Jalen Wilson. Just because he's shouldering an immense load at Kansas, and it's Kansas. It's a big school. They're going to compete. So I think those are kind of where the names are, start. And then, maybe there's a few dark horses in there, but those are the 2 front runner candidates I'd toss in.
Well, do you have? I'm gonna list a dark horse candidate that I have, dark horse-ish candidate that I have. I suppose I'm curious if you have any other ones that you would want to toss out there as well. For me, sticking West Coast, it is Azuolas Tubelis for the Arizona Wildcats. Of course, Arizona has been fantastic so far this year. There was some concern for Tommy Lloyd's team that losing Christian Koloko and Ben Mathurin and Dallin Terry all to the NBA draft last year, that there would be a significant drop-off for this team. They went out and added Courtney Ramey, which was a nice addition. They still have Kirk Risa. They still have Pella Larson. Of course, Umar Ballo has been an absolute star for them down in the paint. But we knew Tubelis was going to come in and have a really nice year, Lithuanian forward, kind of a do-it-all 6'9" guard type player. And so far, he's averaging just under 20 points a game. He's averaging 8 boards. He's averaging 2.5 assists. To me, if Arizona stays in the conversation, if they get that 1 seed out west, which looks quite frankly pretty possible at this point, considering how they've looked so far, how Gonzaga has looked so far, and what I think they'll be able to do in the Pac-12. I think Tubelis could very legitimately be in that conversation by the end of the year.
Yeah, that's a good pick, because Arizona, to me, seems like the best team in the Pac-12. They're going to have little resistance, and then winning certainly correlates with this award, and that's why my dark horses I don't think really have that much of a chance, but they're individual players that I think deserve a shout out. I prepared a bit longer of a list than I should have. But Antoine Davis is an elite scorer for Detroit. He's not going to win the Naismith, but he's scoring 23 a game right now. Jordan Walker at UAB is going to be one of the best mid-major teams. He's leading the nation with 24.6 points per game. So for a little bit of guard love, that's what I got right there. And if we're really extending a little bit, I think you could go Chris Murray. And this is more mainstream. He just had a monster performance last night. He's averaging 21 a game with 10.6 rebounds, and last night had 31 and 20. 31, 20, and 4. So
ridiculous.
He deserves a mention at the very least. So that's my complete list. I just toss them all out there.
I have 2 more on my list. Obviously, there is probably not legitimately 15 or so players in contention for the National Player of the Year, but there are a lot of players having really good years, and I am always on board with mid-major shout-outs, because those guys are absolute ballers, and it is fun to see them having productive years. Of course, my 2 guys that I have left are not mid-major players. I guess depending on what you consider Houston, not really a mid-major. Of course, Marcus Sasser is the guy there. He's not really a dark horse candidate, quite frankly. He was often considered 4th or 5th on that list going into the season, alongside Hunter Dickinson, alongside Trace Jackson Davis. But right now, Houston's number 1 team in the country. When you're the number 1 team in the country and you're the best performing player on the team, you're going to be in that conversation. Sasser's averaging 18 points, about 3 boards, about 3 assists per game. Certainly Houston has a lot of really talented players, but Sasser is kind of the straw that stirs the drinks for them. And then the last one that I wanted to mention, to stick with the theme of the last 2 episodes, which is the UConn Huskies, and that's Adama Sanogo, 18.5 points, 7 boards for him. UConn's a bit more balanced, and so I don't know if they're going to have a Player of the Year candidate legitimately emerge, but if they continue to be a top 10, borderline top 5 team, and Sanogo continues to put up numbers similar to this, he will at least remain in that conversation. All right, Leaf, we're going to come back in the 3rd and final segment of the show. There are so many big games coming up this weekend. Those who like to watch upsets, those who like to wager on upsets, don't want to miss this upcoming segment where we're going to look at some teams that might be put on upset watch this weekend. All right, segment 3. Still Andy Patton, still Locked On College Basketball, still here with Leaf Tulane of the Locked On NBA Big Board. Leaf, wanted to talk about some potential upsets that we might see this weekend or week as we get into the kind of not quite the end of the non-conference slate, although the Pac-12 and a couple other conferences are starting very early for their conference seasons, but still got some fun non-conference games coming up. Is there a game coming up this week or weekend that you're kind of looking at that could end up being an upset for a big team?
Yeah, I think there's a few that you can classify differently. The upsets. There's a couple teams that are the lower ranked team that I think match up well. So the one that I think is a really good team and my favorite in the Big Ten is Illinois, and I think Maryland could put them on upset watch. They're only separated by a few ranking spots, but I think most people coming into the season would say that's a pretty big upset because Maryland wasn't expected to be very good coming in, and Kevin Willard's got his guys doing very well. They play at College Park, so. That's the most high-profile one in the early weekend slate. So I'll start it off there with Kevin Willard kind of getting his marquee win or potentially getting it.
Yeah, I like that one a lot. I thought about putting that one. The job that Willard and Maryland have done so far this season it's one of those things where it's not going to look on paper like a tremendous upset now. But like you said, if you'd predicted that on Halloween, I think it might have looked like a much bigger upset at the time. For me, I teased this one, so I'm just going to straight up say it here. It is Shaheen Holloway and Seton Hall taking on Kansas in that Big 12 Big East showdown. We already saw a major upset where Marquette defeated Baylor, of course. Look, Shaheen's team is really struggling on the offensive end of the floor, and that is going to be the biggest challenge here. Kansas is a top 15 defense, according to KenPom right now. Shaheen's squad in Seton Hall is top 35 defense in KenPom. So it's two good defensive teams, two inconsistent offensive teams. Obviously, Kansas offensively has more firepower, more horses, more talent than the Pirates do at Seton Hall. But I still think this is a potential game where if Seton Hall can kind of slow things down, can play that pressure defense that Holloway's known for, can frustrate Kansas's guards, can kind of get them out of their rhythm a little bit, they're still going to need to find somebody who can put the ball in the hoop, and that's going to be the biggest question. But if they're able to do that, this could be a game that really puts Holloway back on the map, puts Seton Hall back on the map, and really makes us start to question whether Kansas has the horses to win it all this year.
I agree with you. I toyed around with doing that one. I think it's at Fog Allen Fieldhouse though, and that makes me a little more concerned. That said, I've got a big one here. Down goes number one.
Yes,
St. Mary's. First one to 45 wins this game. And I'm not even being hyperbolic.
No, you're not.
This game will be very, very low scoring, very well executed. I don't think there'll be like a lot of turnovers in terms of a defensive clinic, but it'll be rigid defense. The pace will be snail slow. St. Mary's is very good in that setting. Houston struggled with Kent State in that same type of game, and Kent State's actually a really good team. I'm pretty high on them, but aside from the point, St. Mary's will be able to handle the slow pace. They're used to it. They're not going to turn the ball over and be overwhelmed by Houston's athleticism and length. They're solid on the boards. They shoot the ball okay, but they have shooters, and I think that the defensive ball pressure of Houston will bother more teams by more than it bothers St. Mary's. And I think St. Mary's' snail slow pace will corral Houston to the half court. And if Marcus Sasser's off, there's a legitimate chance that this could happen. So I'd be remiss not to mention the chance that number one goes down. However, it is in Texas. So that makes me a little hesitant. If this were in Moraga, this would be my headliner.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Leaf, you stole the last one that I had because that was what I was going to end it with, was the Houston St. Mary's game. I actually have in my notes, you said first to 45, which is funny because my notes quite literally say first to 42. So we're right on the same conversation there. I think that's going to be an extremely fun game. I went ahead and found another game, my backup option for Upset Watch, which is taking place on Saturday, the same day as that epic game between Houston and St. Mary's, and that is Indiana-Rutgers. This game is happening on the road at Rutgers. It is, of course, the start of the Big Ten season. Indiana top 10 team, Trace Jackson-Davis kind of right in that conversation. But Rutgers has been solid so far this year. They are a very good defensive team, currently 11th per KenPom in defense. True road game for Indiana. Again, this is a team that has a win over Xavier, doesn't have a ton of other great wins yet. They're going to take on North Carolina tonight. As we're recording this, that game hasn't happened yet, so we will see how they look in that game. But obviously, Rutgers is not a team that you would expect to beat Indiana necessarily, but true road game, good defensive team. I could see that one happening in a way that might surprise some people.
I'm right there with you. That was on there. I think we've all kind of covered the same ones, and I'll toss in one more. I bet you'll agree with this one.
Mm-hmm.
Michigan hosts Kentucky.
Yeah.
We talked early in the segment. Not a fan of Kentucky,
mm-hmm.
and Michigan just played Virginia. Virginia is one of the more stout, solid, and extremely well coached. They're very rigid. They don't make too many mistakes. And
Mm-hmm.
Michigan was up 11.5. Kentucky, I think will have to play very well and execute because Michigan can score. They scored 68 on Virginia and
mm-hmm.
scored 45 in the first half. So I think that this is prime upset watch. And I'm not even sure it will be. Like, if you look at lines, they haven't come out yet for this game.
Yeah.
But once the lines come out, I'm not sure it won't even favor Michigan.
Yeah.
But in terms of rankings and in terms of preseason expectations, this is an upset. So I'll put Michigan over Kentucky.
Well, Leif, thank you so much for taking time to come on to the show. Always love having your insight, your expertise. Always fun to be able to talk about some potential upsets as we have another fantastic week of college basketball games coming our way. All right, that is going to do it for us today. Don't forget to check out our Locked On College Basketball podcast is on YouTube. So go to YouTube if you haven't done so yet. Hit that big red subscribe button. It is very much appreciated. You can also find us wherever you get podcasts. I want to thank all of you for making Locked On College Basketball your first listen of the day. For your next listen, check out the Locked On Sports Today podcast, the biggest stories of the day, plus instant reactions, big game recaps, and the take of the day. Available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get podcasts. All right, thank you all for listening, and peace out.